Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. This is the first episode of the fifth season of the podcast, which will explore the puzzle of divine foreknowledge and human free will. Our guest, Simon Kittle, introduces the problem of freedom and foreknowledge and gives an overview of the responses to the problem that we'll cover in more detail in the remaining episodes of this season.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Simon Kittle, who's a researcher based in Leeds. Simon is incredibly prolific, has written many articles on free will that will be of interest to our listeners. He's the co-editor of a volume called The Divine Nature, Personal and Apersonal Perspectives, published in 2021 by Routledge. And he's the co-author of an introductory book on the topic of this fifth season of the Free Will Show, namely Divine Foreknowledge and Human Free Will. The book is called God and Human Freedom, published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press as part of the Cambridge Elements series. And it's somehow both short and accessible, but also rich and thorough. I think it's a great introduction to the topic. I'd encourage listeners to check it out. Simon's co-author for that book, Lee Vicens, couldn't join us for this interview, but we'll try to get her to come on the show another time. Thanks so much for joining us, Simon. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Taylor, and thank you for inviting me on and for those kind words. I got interested in free will after a bit of informal study in theology. I was about 26 at the time, and I'd never studied theology or philosophy prior to that. And I was reading about original sin. And what I found was that I couldn't work out how the doctrine of original sin that was taught in my church was either just or fair. It seemed to be just the opposite. So I just got really captured by this topic, and I did more and more reading on topics of responsibility and free will. And I concluded fairly quickly, I guess, that at least some of the theological writing on the topic of freedom wasn't as precise as I would like it to have been, or that I know exists out there, and that if I wanted to pursue the topic further, I'd need to focus more on philosophy. So that's what I did, and I discovered that there were many dimensions to the topic of agency and free will, and they all seemed really super interesting, and I had the good fortune to be able to pursue a PhD in that field, and that's what I'm still studying now as a postdoc.
Nice.
Yeah, very cool. In the first season of the podcast, we interviewed Linda Zagzebski on the problem of freedom and foreknowledge, and she presented an argument for the incompatibility of these things, of divine foreknowledge and human free will. Would you like to explain what's meant by free will in this debate and why it seems to be threatened by divine foreknowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. So to begin with the type of free will that's at stake in the debate, the type of free will in question is sometimes called the freedom to do otherwise. And according to this understanding of free will, a person is only free at a given time if they have multiple options or alternatives with respect to what they can do, and it's up to the person which action they do. So sometimes the point is put retrospectively. We can say that for any action the person has performed, the person will have done that freely only if the person could have done otherwise or was able to have done otherwise. The basic idea could be illustrated quite nicely with an example. So suppose I smoke a cigarette. According to the view in question, where freedom requires the freedom to do otherwise, I smoke that cigarette freely only if I could have chosen to refrain from smoking. If I'm addicted to smoking, say, if it's literally true that I could not have chosen to refrain, then my smoking would not be something I did freely. Sometimes this sort of freedom is called leeway freedom. I think that this label is a little bit unhelpful and also tendentious. So I try to avoid it and just be a bit more explicit about talking about the freedom to do otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the view of free will in question.
Mm-hmm.
Why does divine foreknowledge seem to threaten this view of free will? I find it easiest when thinking about the argument to focus on a particular or a specific future decision or action. So with that in mind, let's focus on what I decide to do this time next year. So what I decide to do on the afternoon of August the 2nd, 2023. At this point, I have no idea what I'll do. I don't even know what my options will be. But let's suppose that I will, in fact, decide to go on a hike and then actually go on a hike. So the argument for the incompatibility of divine foreknowledge and the freedom to do otherwise goes something like this. God is infallible or essentially omniscient, and this means that it's necessarily true that God knows everything. So it's impossible for God to fail to believe something true, and it's impossible for God to believe something false. And we also start by assuming that God's omniscience includes knowledge about the future.
Mm-hmm.
So it follows from this that God knew 1,000 years ago that on the afternoon of August the 2nd, 2023, I will decide to go for a hike and then go hiking. Now, this divine belief is in the past. God believed 1,000 years ago what I'm going to do. But the past, as we often say, is over and done with. This is why we say things like, don't cry over spilt milk, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't cry because there's nothing we can now do about that spilt milk. And that's because the past, we have these intuitions that the past is fixed, that it's unalterable, that it's done.
Mm-hmm.
So it follows that God's past belief about my future decision is itself fixed and unalterable. Relative to now, God's past belief is what is sometimes called temporally necessary. And that just means it has whatever necessity or fixity comes from something's being in the past. Now, the next stage of the argument appeals again to God's infallibility. And so it's the idea that it's necessary that whatever God believed at a past time about some aspect of the future comes to pass. And it must come to pass because of that essential omniscience. So God's past belief about my going on a hike next year is necessary or fixed because it's in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing can change the fact that 1,000 years ago God believed I'd go on a hike next year. But in addition, what God believed about the future, namely my going on a hike, must of necessity come to pass because of God's infallibility.
Mm-hmm.
So this seems to suggest that my deciding to go on a hike and then actually go on a hike is already, right now, fixed. And that seems to imply that next year I'm not going to be able to decide to refrain from going on a hike. But that's exactly what's required according to this notion of freedom that's in play, the freedom to do otherwise. And so we conclude, or we're asked to conclude by the proponent of the argument, that divine foreknowledge implies I'm not free with respect to my decision to go on a hike. And obviously, this argument generalizes. It can be run for any action you care to choose. So we are then invited to make the general conclusion that foreknowledge is incompatible with human free will.
Thanks. That was a really helpful summary of the argument.
Mhm.
Before we turn to some of the main responses to the challenge in the literature, I thought it might be worth talking about a couple of common initial responses, often that I hear from students when I teach this kind of argument in a philosophy class. So one that we might frequently hear is that something has to have gone wrong in this argument because mere foreknowledge of an event doesn't make the event happen, right? And one way to kind of see this is by thinking about a case of human foreknowledge. Suppose I knew yesterday that Matt was going to sign on to this call today. I take myself to have known that even yesterday. Surely my knowledge yesterday didn't make Matt sign on to this call, and it seems like he, very well could have done otherwise. So what's supposed to be different about divine foreknowledge such that it's a threat to free will?
That's a really good question and really important question. And I think there are a couple of things that the proponent of the argument will want to say at this point. And the first thing would be this. The way you phrased it in the initial response in your example, you said you knew that Matt was going to sign on, but as you said, surely your knowledge didn't make Matt sign on. And that thought, I think, seems to be absolutely correct.
Yeah.
But it is important to see that the foreknowledge argument itself doesn't actually say that divine foreknowledge makes or causes or brings about the person's future decision or action.
Right.
So the argument simply starts from the concept of God's infallible knowledge, and then it concludes that there is some kind of fixity, which leads us to conclude that divine foreknowledge is incompatible with free will. So this kind of initial response is not quite going to be on target if it relies on the claim that foreknowledge makes the person decide or act, because the argument doesn't actually need to claim as much. Nevertheless, we can easily rephrase the initial response to avoid this kind of concern or worry. So we could say, surely your knowledge didn't fix things, didn't fix Matt signing on, or surely your knowledge didn't render it necessary that Matt would sign on. Even though you knew he'd sign on, like you said, it seems like he very well could have done otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the general consensus, if there is a general consensus, is that sort of reasoning is correct. And so in light of that, the proponent of the argument does need to explain why there is this difference between divine foreknowledge and human foreknowledge. And typically, what the proponent of the argument says is that the key difference is that God is, but humans are not infallible.
Yeah.
So we can illustrate why this is relevant with your example. You knew that Matt would sign on, but this didn't fix anything. Matt could have done otherwise, and if Matt had done otherwise, then he would have rendered your belief, Taylor, false. So if Matt had made a different decision, the contents of your past belief would have remained the same, but the belief would have been false.
Mm-hmm.
But God's infallibility means that simply isn't an option when it comes to divine foreknowledge. There is no making God's past beliefs false. You can't render one of God's past beliefs false. So whatever God believed in the past must, about the future, must come to pass. And so this is why God's foreknowledge, divine foreknowledge, seems to generate a problem, even though human foreknowledge doesn't.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes critics of the argument say that there's some kind of fallacy going on here, that the argument rests on a fallacy, namely inferring the necessity of the consequent from the necessity of the consequence. Could you briefly explain this criticism and say whether you think it's a good one?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fallacy of inferring the necessity of the consequent from the necessity of the consequence is this. Suppose we have some conditional, if A, then B, and suppose that this conditional is necessarily true. So it's necessary that if A, then B. When the entire conditional is a necessary truth, we have what's called the necessity of the consequence. Now, suppose A is also true. So it's true that A, and it's true that necessarily if A, then B. From these two truths, we can infer B.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be a modal fallacy to infer necessarily B.
Yeah.
This would be to infer what's called the necessity of the consequent being the second part of the conditional.
Mm-hmm.
The first part of the conditional is known in logic as the antecedent. Do I think that this is a good objection or has any traction against the foreknowledge argument? No, I don't actually think it does. So I think it's true that this is a fallacy in modal logic, but I don't think the argument from foreknowledge commits this fallacy, or at least it doesn't need to commit it. Okay, we can give a presentation of the argument which doesn't commit it. And the reason I think this is that in the foreknowledge argument, the equivalent of proposition A, the antecedent in our conditional if A then B, the equivalent of A would be the proposition about God's past belief. Mm-hmm. So if we return to my example, it would be God believed 1,000 years ago that I will go for a hike on August the 2nd, 2023. Now, the argument from divine foreknowledge claims that that proposition is necessary with the kind of necessity that derives from the fixity or the fixedness of the past. So the argument does have that in the kind of reserve, as it were, that it's not committed to saying A has no necessity attached to it in and of itself. So I don't think this observation carries much weight as an objection to the argument, but what I do think it shows is that it's quite tricky to formalize the argument from divine foreknowledge in a system of logic. And that's because you have two forms of necessity in play, and they're different. So we have the necessity or the fixity of the past, and that attaches to God's past belief, the existence of that belief. And then we have the necessity which derives from God's infallibility. And this is what's going to transfer the necessity to the future. But this looks to be a different kind of necessity, something closer to maybe absolute or metaphysical necessity because it's grounded in God's being.
Right.
Now, in standard systems of modal logic, the necessity operator is going to refer to some form of metaphysical necessity, and therefore you can't use the same operator to refer to both kinds of necessity.
Right.
And therefore, it's very difficult to express the full force of the argument in a standard system of modal logic. And so it might look as if the argument commits this fallacy, but to me, that's just because it's pretty difficult to formalize it well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That was great. That was super helpful. Thanks, Simon. All right. Well, if we could turn now to some of the main responses to the challenge, the positions in the debate, as it were. Matt mentioned earlier our interview with Linda Zagzebski, and in that interview, she sketched three types of response, kind of historically significant responses to the problem, on behalf of compatibilists, those who think, in the context of this debate, that divine foreknowledge and human freedom to do otherwise are compatible. And she called these the Boethian, the Occamist, and the Molinist responses. So we're going to do a deeper dive into each of those three responses in our next three episodes, and so we'll explore them in more detail. But could you remind us briefly of those responses and also mention any other responses which reject the conclusion that divine foreknowledge precludes the freedom to do otherwise?
Yep. So, very briefly, the three responses mentioned by Zagzebski. We've got the Boethian response, which claims that God is outside of time and, as such, not subject to any necessity or fixity deriving from the past. The Occamist response, which claims that statements about God's past beliefs are in the past tense grammatically, but that doesn't mean they are wholly or entirely about the past. Occamists say that these statements are partly about the future, and this is supposed to mean, once again, that they don't generate a problematic form of necessity or fixity. And the third response that she mentioned was the Molinist response, which purports to solve the problem by appealing to the so-called counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. In addition to those three compatibilist responses, there are two others worth mentioning, which reject the conclusion that divine foreknowledge precludes the freedom to do otherwise. And these are compatibilism about determinism and freedom to do otherwise, and dependence-based responses. So I'll briefly go over each of these in turn. So taking compatibilism about determinism and free will first. Very roughly, causal determinism is the view that the past state of the universe, together with the laws of nature, entails the next state of the universe. Typically, this is going to be understood to mean that the past state deterministically causes the next state. Theological determinism is the view that God's decrees determine or cause or bring about every state of the universe. And that's going to include every human thought, every act of will, decision, and so on. Now, compatibilism about either of these forms of determinism and free will, freedom to do otherwise, says that a person can freely perform an action A, even if they're determined by prior causes or by God to do so. So according to this type of compatibilism, even when a person is determined to A, it may still be that the person could have done otherwise or was able to have done otherwise, and therefore may still have been free. Clearly, if free will is compatible with God's determining or causing or making you do something, then God's foreknowledge that you'll do that thing isn't going to really produce any sort of additional problem.
Yeah.
So for compatibilists of this sort, where we're talking about compatibilism between determinism and the freedom to do otherwise, they've got a ready-made response to this argument because they're already committed to something stronger, if you like, than compatibilism about foreknowledge and free will.
Right.
So that's compatibilism, or that form of compatibilism, as the first response. The second type of response that was not mentioned in that Zagzebski episode is dependence-based responses. These responses appeal to the thought that a proposition which was true in the past might be true because of what happens in the future. So in other words, the past truth of a proposition depends on the future occurrence of the event. So if we return to the example, this view would say, yes, it was true 1,000 years ago that I would decide to go on a hike August the 2nd, 2023. And of course, because it was true, God knew that it was true. But the past truth of that proposition depended on my actually deciding in 2023 to go on a hike. And the thought is, if the past truth depends on what I'll do in the future, then the past truth clearly can't restrict or fix what I will do in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It was true in the past that I'll go on the hike in 2023 only because in 2023 I do indeed decide to do that. So if that's the right explanatory relationship, then it just doesn't seem as if the past truth or any knowledge of that truth is going to fix or necessitate the future in any sense that would threaten the freedom to do otherwise. And that's because for these folks taking this kind of line, when they evaluate what someone is able to do, they would say, you don't need to hold fixed anything which depends on what the person does.
Mm-hmm.
So when considering whether I could or am able to decide in 2023 to refrain from going on a hike, we don't need to hold fixed the past truth that I will in 2023 decide to go on a hike, because although that was a past truth, that truth depends on that decision. So we don't need to hold it fixed, and therefore there's no blockage to saying I could have decided otherwise, no blockage to saying that I'm free.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the basics of the dependence response, and there are various different versions of this response according to how the key notion of dependence is further explicated or explained.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. So, what are some of the responses to the problem that can accept the conclusion that foreknowledge precludes the freedom to do otherwise?
Yeah, so I think there are two main types of response in this category. So, two main types of response which can accept that divine foreknowledge is incompatible with the freedom to do otherwise. This would be sourcehood-based responses and open theism.
Mm-hmm.
So sourcehood-based responses to the argument work by challenging or simply rejecting the concept of freedom that the argument employs.
Mm-hmm.
So as we've already seen, the argument states that divine foreknowledge threatens free will when free will is conceived of as the freedom to do otherwise. But some people, including some incompatibilists about determinism and free will, reject this notion of freedom, and they endorse what's known as sourcehood notions of freedom. And according to such notions, free will does not require that a person have a choice between alternatives and that it be up to the person which alternative is realized. What free will requires is that the person be the genuine origin or source of their decision and action. So these folks are typically convinced by Harry Frankfurt's arguments to the effect that he has shown that free will does not require the ability to do otherwise. So that's their motivation for taking this stance.
Mm-hmm.
So that motivation is independent of anything to do with the foreknowledge issue. And some incompatibilist sourcehood theorists think that because they endorse this view of free will, they have a simple response to the foreknowledge argument. The foreknowledge argument purports to show that the fixity of God's past beliefs, together with God's infallibility, means that the future is fixed in a way that removes the person's ability to do otherwise. But since sourcehood theorists reject that notion of freedom, the conclusion of the argument just doesn't seem to apply to them. So they can just argue that it's beside the point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sourcehood-based responses. Next is open theist responses. Open theists also accept the conclusion that divine foreknowledge is incompatible with freedom to do otherwise. But unlike sourced theorists, open theists usually hold that free will does indeed require the ability to do otherwise. So they respond to the argument by critiquing the assumption that omniscience requires knowledge of the future. And there are two basic versions of this response. The first is called limited foreknowledge open theism. And according to this view, omniscience requires that God knows everything that it is logically possible to know, but it's not possible to know all truths about the future. In particular, it's impossible to know truths about what people will do freely in the future. So open theists in this camp argue that, or will support their position by saying that, just as omnipotence, say, doesn't require God to be able to literally do anything, but only what is logically possible for God to do, omnipotence doesn't require God to be able to sin, for instance. Mm-hmm. So omniscience doesn't require God to literally know everything, but only what is logically possible for God to know. And this doesn't include truths about future free actions. The second version of the open theist response is called open future open theism. And according to this view, the future is open in the sense that there is as yet no truth about what will occur with respect to future free actions. So there are truths about what might occur or how someone might act. But for those events which were not yet settled one way or another, there is no truth about what will occur. So open theists in this camp will therefore say that God is omniscient in the strongest possible sense, but given that there are no truths about future free actions, there is nothing there for God to know.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And for our listeners, we're going to have episodes on all these positions. We won't talk about the sort of compatibilist view that's also compatibilism about causal determinism and the freedom to do otherwise, although we've had some episodes on classical compatibilism and dispositional compatibilism before, and those views would apply in exactly the way Simon just discussed. But we will have a view at the end of the season on a kind of source compatibilism, which is a sort of variant of the source incompatibilist position that Simon mentioned, and we'll have an episode on. Just as a quick follow-up, Simon, do you have a settled view on this? Do you fit into one of these camps that you just identified?
I have settled views about some of these issues, but not all of them. I guess maybe quite typically, I'm more sure about the positions I think are wrong than I am about which ones are right.
So which ones are wrong?
Yeah, the appeal to sourcehood incompatibilism or libertarianism, that doesn't seem like it's got much going for it to my mind. Source incompatibilists, they don't require that the agent be able to do otherwise. So the agent doesn't need to be able to select from the alternatives, but they still require genuine causally open alternatives. Those causally open alternatives are what ground the strong incompatibilist notion of sourcehood. But it seems to me that God's past beliefs about what happened in the future, they're going to apply just as much to those supposedly causally open alternatives. I mean, that's precisely why people think divine foreknowledge precludes the ability to do otherwise, because it means they can't really be causally open. And so divine foreknowledge, it seems to me, would fix things in a way which means those alternatives, in scare quotes, aren't really going to be genuine alternatives. And so it seems like you could reframe the argument from divine foreknowledge so that it's targeted not at the ability to do otherwise, but towards those causally open alternatives which the sourcehood theorist still requires for free will. So the problem wouldn't be identical, but it seems like the problem would be just as hard. So I wouldn't, I don't think that's a particularly. I don't think that response has got much going for it. And I guess I would say the same about Molinism.
Mm-hmm.
Molinism seems to me to just straightforwardly presuppose that free will is compatible with divine foreknowledge. Why? Because it presupposes that in any given situation where someone has to make a decision, there is in fact a truth of the matter about what someone will freely decide to do. And it presupposes that God can know that truth. But that is exactly what the argument from foreknowledge calls into question. And that just seems really, really straightforward to me. And I think so. William Hasker kind of, argued for this sort of view, or presented this kind of position in his classic 1989 book, God, Time, and Knowledge. And I think those arguments still stand if for anyone who needs arguments to be persuaded of that. And, if it's not kind of intuitively obvious that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are an impossibility.
Mm-hmm.
What Molinism might give you, of course, is an account of how foreknowledge works, how foreknowledge relates to the rest of God's knowledge. So if middle knowledge were a cogent idea, Molinism would give you great tools to develop a strong doctrine of providence, but it strikes me that it's of no help at all in establishing the compatibility of divine foreknowledge with free will. And I think in the Zagzebski episode in the first season of your podcast, she pointed out that Molinism does not entail the falsity of any of the foreknowledge argument's premises. And that seems to me to be very telling. It strongly suggests or reinforces the point that Molinism itself, in and of itself, isn't actually a solution to the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm very convinced of those two negative points. In terms of a positive position, I incline towards open future, open theism, but that is a less settled view.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, this is a long-standing debate with lots of contributions over centuries. So why have so many theologians and philosophers, even secular ones, been interested in this problem? And are there any other implications for other issues in philosophy and theology?
Yeah, I think the foreknowledge problem is of enduring interest, even to those not interested in religion at all, because it both depends upon and throws up questions about many areas in philosophy in addition to the topic of free will. So it touches on issues of modality, ontology, causation, truth. And these are all key areas in philosophy. And so I think that's maybe one of the reasons why it garners wide interest, even among those with no religious faith or affiliation. As for the enduring interest among religious people, well, I think the argument has huge implications for how we understand God and how we understand God's relation to and interaction with creation. So one example of this would be that the response you give to the foreknowledge argument puts constraints on how one can understand the doctrine of providence. So open theists, for instance, a classic example, they cannot endorse a doctrine of meticulous providence, according to which God is in complete control of everything that happens. Many open theists see that as a positive because it looks to provide a substantial explanation for evil, which doesn't have the result that all evils are intended by God.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it's going to bring costs. Among other things, it raises tough questions about how God can realize the divine purposes, which people who adopt or endorse a different response to the foreknowledge issue, they're just not even going to have a problem with at all.
Right.
Another example of a theological implication might be the following. Suppose that the only good response to the argument were the atemporal outside of time response. Well, that would commit theists to defending a metaphysics according to which God is atemporal. And that notion seems quite difficult or quite baffling to many people, how an atemporal entity subject to no change could be a living, acting being, as the Christian God is supposed to be. So that would potentially be a cost, or at least an implication, which theists would have to deal with if one were led in that direction or concluded that that was the best way to respond. And this is just scratching the surface of the sort of wider implications that taking a stand on the foreknowledge question has. And I think these are the kinds of reasons why it continues and will continue to be of a great interest to a variety of thinkers.
Well, thanks so much, Simon. This has been great. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been really good to talk with you both. I have a website which lists articles I've published, and the address for that is simonkittle.com. So people can check that out for more.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks again. In our next episode, we'll explore the Boethian or timelessness response in more detail, and our guest will be Catherine Rogers, professor of philosophy at the University of Delaware.